Youth pastors, have you ever had a high school student say to you, I don't want to come to youth group with that middle schooler? Give us a like if you know a high school student who has done that, and maybe subscribe if you've actually never heard that. And then the rest of us who have liked the video because we've had high school students do that will either know that you're lying or we're gonna be super jealous, because you and me all know that in the back of our heads, right? Like, we may or may not have the bandwidth or the time to split up the middle school and the high school students. And so in today's video, we're going to explore the best, most premium and optimal time and way to split up your middle school and your high school students. We'll talk about the 3 factors to consider. We will ask 2 clarifying questions in each of those sections, the top 2 pros, the top 2 cons, and finally, some creative hacks to get around making the big switch if you know you're not ready for it or don't have the time for it. Factor number 1 is your size. Like, you have to consider how big is your group. What is your average group's critical mass? That's question number 1. And then number 2 in the size question is, what momentum will be lost by splitting up your students? The other factor you have to consider is your bandwidth. For example, like, do you have the bandwidth to split middle school and high school? When I was working at a church early on in my ministry, I determined that we had a big enough critical mass and that we could withstand the switch. But then we had to switch, and I had to add to my calendar and my schedule another night to meet, and I ended up deciding to make that decision in that season of life. It was the right move and it was the right call. So we did middle school on Wednesday night and we did high school on Sunday night. Prior to that, we did both of them together on Wednesday night. So Sunday night was a new addition. And looking back, I don't know actually, because I only ended up running it for a year prior to me then moving on to a different church. I don't know if it was the right decision. You have to measure and know what your bandwidth is, and if you have the bandwidth to split. And I would recommend right here at the top of this video a video where we talked about time management, and go through that. And that little exercise might actually help give you some clarification on, do you truly have the bandwidth? Also, the second question under bandwidth is, do you potentially have a volunteer to help you own that other piece, that other split piece as you navigate? And then the third factor, of course, is space. Does your space in your church, does it accommodate it? And the second question is, what constraints is this going to put on your space? So for example, I worked at a church that didn't have a lot of space, even though it was a big church, a big multi-site church in Chicago area. But other ministries had other nights of the week that they had things going on, like our groups ministry met and our junior high ministry met and our like grief share met. I can't remember all the different ones, but there's always like a different ministry on a different night of the week. And so our decision to either have junior high and high school all together or split up was going to either demand 2 nights a week for our space or just 1. And then that dictated how and when the other ministries in your space met. So a couple of pros for splitting up middle school and high school. Again, if your size, if your bandwidth, and if your space will all kind of accommodate it, and if all those factors that you ask those questions swirl around or working together. Pro number 1, of course, is like developmentally splitting middle school and high school seems to be appropriate. I mean, you just think about it. Like, think of that 6th grade boy in your group and then think of that 12th grade girl. Like, developmentally speaking, they're just in 2 different spots. And this is no shade thrown on that 6th grade boy or that 12th grade girl, but you know they each need different things. They need to be challenged in a different way. And so splitting them up will help you as a youth pastor be able to navigate that well, to be able to really truly give and provide for each of those people individually what they need and what they're looking for. Pro number 2 is that probably the high school students' preference. It may not be the middle school student's preference on the top, but underneath that, it may actually be the best thing for a middle school student to give them their own space to just simply be a middle schooler and not have high schoolers looking over frustratedly or condemningly or even just being annoyed. And the high school students may want their own space to kind of lean into and be uniquely high school students. But the cons, of course, are it is more taxing on you as the individual, or on you and your time, or on you and your space. And so you may be in a context that has multiple staff, and so that may be the solution. One of you runs one night and one of you runs another night. But if you are your own person and if you do not have the staff to accommodate something like this, then it is going to be more taxing. And another con I honestly would say is that it's not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily give students a realistic view and or picture of the rest of life and the rest of the world. Like right now, I am a 34-year-old youth pastor at a church, and there is not one other 34-year-old on my staff. As far as I know, I could be wrong, and I might not be thinking about a certain person, but the fact of the matter is, like, I interact with boomers and Xers and some other millennials, just not my exact age, and also some people that are Gen Z. And so on our staff, we have an age range all the way from 20 up to like 60, 65-ish, right? Like we have a big span of age. And so sometimes like segmenting down our ministries, while they may be developmentally good, while they may also be like preferences of certain ages, like the high school students, the middle school students, it may not be what is best for them, and it may not give them the most realistic picture of what their future life is going to be. Which leads me to my third idea: 3 creative hacks to kind of get around this if you don't have the bandwidth and if you're not quite yet ready to split middle school and high school. The first one is stagger your programming. So maybe you have your students meet all within the same time block, which I would probably recommend for like parents' sake. If they have a middle school student and a high school student, they don't have to drop off and pick up at different times. So if it's like 6 to 8, they drop off both students, but then inside the building, middle schoolers are in this element of your service and high schoolers are in this element of the service, and then they switch, and then high schoolers switch to this element while middle schoolers then switch to that element. That is a way for you to lean into a good volunteer to be able to run the additional space so that you can be teaching or running the game or wherever you need to be in those moments. But it will also give middle school and high school students their own unique, different setup and their own unique, different space. Another creative hack, honestly, that I have is consider the idea of going hybrid. And you're like, wait a minute, that doesn't do anything for the space. And in some ways, you're 100% right, but linked right here in my 100% completely free ebook, I will lead you through how to develop out a hybrid strategy. And the bedrock, the baseline for my hybrid strategy is begin pre-filming your talks ahead of time. Pre-film your talks and then post them to YouTube. And then from there, as you maybe clip up a few of those using a service linked down below like OPUS.PRO to give you AI generated shorts, reels, and TikToks, you can sprinkle those in throughout your week. And then the last piece of it is you can then add in and infuse an element of fun into your social media, and you can use your students to do that. And so perhaps an element of your creative staggered programming is creating a space for your students to come together and get on video and make content with you. And you might be thinking like, wait a minute, do they even want to do that? And the answer to that is yes. Generation Z and Generation Alpha, they live in a publisher type of generation with a publisher type of mindset. And most of us have been raised in an industrial age where we create content and or we create an environment that we then sit down and we produce it and or deliver it to people, and then we assume that they want to just sit and consume it. And the tables are turned in that day and age. And so the advantage is, while digital is the language of teenagers, you can include them in your strategy. Another hack I have for you is that you can make your small groups like more age and more gender graded. And so if you don't have the bandwidth yet to split apart your big middle school and high school group, when you break them down into small groups, whether that be on a different night of the week or even the same night that they're all together, when you do that, you then give them that space. And so maybe you teach to a large room and you do have to sort of hit the middle, hit somewhere between that 6th grade and that 12th grader. But when they break down into their small groups, they're more age appropriate and they're more age and grade and gender graded. And then finally, an idea could be simply to just lean in to the age discrepancy. You know there's an age discrepancy. You know it may not be ideal and or it may not be everyone's preference, but if you lean into it and if you let the middle schoolers have the high schoolers have a little bit more fun, and then if you lean into the high schoolers and allow them to see that they have an opportunity to step up and be leaders to these middle school students, which it can be a win-win for you and for your youth ministry, which is why I have linked right here on the screen, Youth Group Growth. How do we reach Generation Alpha and Generation Z in this new world that we find ourselves in? So go ahead, take a look at that video, and don't forget that we're trying to make digital discipleship easy, possible, and accessible. So as always, stay hybrid.